Will you be remembered after you're dead? The Z-List Deadlist podcast about obscure people from history with me, Iszi Lawrence. Hello and welcome to episode 6, series 10 of the Z-List Deadlist. How are you? I hope you are well. I have made many errors in my life, which I will tell you about. But first I will say what is coming up in this episode, and that is Lucy Porter, one of my favourite comedians in the country and also one of the smallest. You can put her in most luggage and carry around the place. She's very useful, compact and incredibly funny. And she's going to tell you what links a metal pineapple, Narnia, the National Trust, gangs, and Catholicism. So, yeah, there is one woman that unites all of those things very well indeed. And the Bayeux Tapestry. Anyway, it doesn't matter. First of all, I have to make an addendum to the previous episode, which was all about Victorian poo. Go listen to it. But in that, I do misattribute the discovery of cholera being waterborne to Chadwick, and it wasn't Chadwick, it was, of course, Jon Snow. Thousands of men don't need to die, only one of us. Let's end this the old way, you against me. That's what he said to cholera. Obviously not that Jon Snow from Game of Thrones, that would be ridiculous. No, Jon Snow and his amazing dot map technology. Because in 1854 in Broad Street, which is now Broadwick Street, you can still go there, the pumper's gone, but there is a little plaque there. There was in 1854 a massive outbreak of cholera. It killed 616 people, and this is not a large area, guys. That is quite a lot of people dead. And everybody thought cholera was caused by miasma. The rotting soil, the smell of the Thames, all those little particles of the scent. But why did they all die in this particular area, thought Jon Snow. That makes no sense. I know, I will get a map and I will plot out the death, which is what he did. And he found in the centre of all the death was this particular water pump, which was taken out in 2016, but you can still see the plaque, so it's still there. And therefore he basically discovered germ theory before germ theory, because germ theory didn't come about until, 1861? That was Louis Pasteur, wasn't it? Of pasteurisation fame. That's right, he's the one who messed with your milk. Anyway, point is, I got that entirely wrong last week's episode, and I took all the credit away from the nerd that was Jon Snow, who saved thousands of lives, and I am a very bad Izzy. I apologise. I would fail my medicine through time, or at least get a C. Anyway, we are going to listen to fabulous Lucy Porter in the British Museum, where I am back next week on the 22nd of March. If you haven't got your tickets, quickly, 22nd of March, we've got Emma Kennedy, we've got James Harkin, QI Elf, we've got Andy Riley, and we've got one of the British Museum curators. Go online to britishmuseum.org and buy your tickets. It will be an awesome show. Also, if you are not doing anything tonight and you live in Cambridge, I will be there. That is Thursday, March the 16th? Shut up, 15th? Shut up, I know the dates. Oh my God, it's been one of those weeks, guys. It's been one of those weeks. Anyway, you can read, in fact, about my lovely week on my blog at izzy.com, where I had to deal with rape heckles, among everything else. So I'm a bit fractured, and it might explain why I've gone and lost the interview that I had with Lucy Porter. I did a lovely interview with her, and it was great. And we did it in the Wellcome Trust, and we had coffee, and it was wonderful, and she was funny and witty and brilliant, and I can't find it. So you're just getting the performance. It is enough. It's more than enough. She's amazing. She's brilliant. Go catch her right now. She is on tour. Ladies and gentlemen, please, will you listen to the wonderful Lucy Porter?
Oh, it is. What an honour. Thank you. I'm delighted as he booked me, even though I have no beard. I love men with beards as well, because the thing about men with beards is you get to kiss and exfoliate at the same time. And it's lovely. It's a wonderful thing. So I have been massively enjoying hearing everyone speak, and to be honest, the woman I'm going to present to you tonight, I'm slightly obsessed with her and always excited to get a chance to talk about her. I'm sort of nominating her. She was part of a gang, so I'm going to talk about the gang as well. But the woman I am nominating is Margaret Stewart Gladstone Pollard. Now, so she was born in 1904, and she was born in Westminster. She was the great niece of Gladstone, the Liberal Prime Minister. So she was part of a sort of old political dynasty, and she was born in Westminster. She was born within the sound of Big Ben, which is, at Cockneys are born within the sound of Bow Bells. If you're very posh, then you're born within the sound of Big Ben. And she was this terribly posh woman. And I have always had a bit of a thing. I'm sort of lower middle class, I would say. And I, like a lot of British people, I'm slightly class obsessed. And I have always been obsessed with posh women because I love them. I have a sort of slightly weird erotic fixation with like posh. I'm from Croydon, which, as you may know, is a lovely little fishing village just to the south of London. But I've always been fascinated by the posh women, and as well as being fascinated by posh women, I've also always been fascinated by gangs of women. I wrote a play about one which was called The Fair Intellectual Club, which was a gang of Scottish girls in the early 18th century. I'm also obsessed with the 40 Elephants, who are a gang of female thieves from Elephant and Castle in the 30s. And this is a gang, Margaret Pollard, or Peggy Pollard as I will refer to her from now on, she was the leader of a gang called Ferguson's Gang. Now, give me a quick cheer. If you're a member of the National Trust, give me a cheer. I thought there would be a crossover with the British Museum membership and the National Trust membership. So I first came to know about Peggy Pollard and Ferguson's Gang about 6 or 7 years ago when my children were just first born, and like a lot of parents, I hammered the hell out of my National Trust membership. I do even now, because when you have small children and it's the weekend, National Trust properties are like the best thing because you can get out and you can go for free, and it's, my children hate it. They're like, "Mummy, why are we going to another big house or a garden?" And I'm like, well, you can either go there or we can stay inside and I will beat you. Those are the choices, really. And so on this particular occasion, about 7 years ago, we went to Shalford Mill, which is just outside Guildford. And at first it wasn't a very prepossessing National Trust property. It's a tiny little mill. It's on I've had to write down the name of the river because I can never remember. It's a tributary of the Wey. It's the Tillingbourne. The Tillingbourne is the name of the river. So we went to this little mill, and it at first seemed, it's a mill, nice, whatever. And then I went inside and there was an exhibition, and it was all about Ferguson's Gang. Now, Ferguson's Gang were a group of society ladies who, in the 1930s, began to raise money for the National Trust. Sounds quite dull, but then I read more about them, and they didn't just raise money for the National Trust, but they did it in really exciting ways. They wore masks, they never revealed their identities, and they used to deliver money to the National Trust in kind of fun ways. One of their contributions to the National Trust was delivered inside the carcass of a goose. Who wouldn't love that? Nothing says let's preserve heritage like the carcass of a goose. More inspiringly, they wrapped some of their donations. They wrapped pound notes around miniatures of spirits. At one National Trust AGM, I think it was 1934, when there was an IRA bombing campaign that was gripping London with terror, they delivered their donation of money to the National Trust inside a metal pineapple. So masked figures came into the National Trust AGM and handed a metal pineapple to the Marquis of Zetland, who immediately threw it at an underling, and everyone got under the table, and then it turns out it's Ferguson's Gang. So they achieved a certain amount of notoriety at the time. There were various local and national, in fact, newspaper reports about Ferguson's Gang. I'll read you one of those. This was from November 1933. Last year, a mysterious body known as Ferguson's Gang bought the 18th century Shalford watermill on the Tillingbourne near Guildford and presented it to the National Trust. They did more, for they put it into a condition of thorough repair and promised to endow a sum of £500. In the evening of January the 13th last, a masked woman announcing herself as Red Biddy called at the offices of the National Trust at 7 Buckingham Palace Gardens and handed to the secretary a bag containing £100 in silver coins. This, she said, was the gang's first instalment of the promised endowment. She left without disclosing her identity. Now the remainder of the endowment has been paid in equally unusual manner. Recently, a masked man handed in his card Ferguson's gang representative, Herb the Smasher. He saw the secretary, to whom he handed 200 £1 Bank of England notes, together with an illuminated sealed document signed by all the members of the gang, including Red Biddy, and announcing the discharge of their debt to the National Trust. The Smasher left as he arrived unrecognised. The other members of the gang also hide their identity, but the document was signed Ferguson, the Bloody Bishop, Sister Agatha, A.B., Bill Stickers, Kate O'Brien, Uncle Gregory, Black Mariah, P.P., poor old Aris, and old Poll Paddington. Right. So basically, this gang, there was no Ferguson. They were called Ferguson's gang, but this gang was the brainchild of Margaret Peggy Pollard, because she was a fantastically dynamic, energetic, one of those sort of redoubtable posh women who could do anything. She was born, as I say, in 1904 into this sort of quite posh family. Her childhood was like a fairly standard posh childhood. After a few years, her family left their home within Buckingham Palace's grounds and they moved to Nanhurst near Cranley. She grew up fairly untroubled by the First World War, as a lot of posh people. The war didn't really make much impact on the posh. She said in her diary, "The undergardener joined up and that was our lot." So she was an incredibly bright young woman. She was educated. Basically, they tried to send her to schools, but there was no school that could contain her intellect. So she was tutored at home. And she said of her education, "I got through that sort of thing like lightning and still had lots of time to waste. I had no friends. I used to go off by myself and invent gods and supernatural companions and religions of my own. Whereas the Da and Mummy were both atheists, or rather the Da was a polytheist, I had a built-in desire for a god of some sort, and if one was not forthcoming, I would make one, that's all." So she was just sort of incredibly interested in sort of metaphysical matters. And at 17, with the encouragement of her mother, she applied to Newnham College in Cambridge, one of the recently endowed women's colleges. And she was planning to study French and English, but she went along to the interview and her mum came with her and said, "Oh, she's quite interested in Sanskrit at the moment. She's been studying a lot about the Hindu religion." And of course, I love this idea of universities in the olden days. So her mum said that in the interview, and of course the interviewer just went, "Well, she'd bloody well better do Oriental languages then." And she was like, "Yeah, all right, yeah, I'll do that." So she became the first woman to graduate with the double first in Oriental languages from Cambridge. She wrote a PhD so her PhD was a book about Vishnu. Only 2 copies were published, one of which was held in the British Museum at the time, and the other one Peggy used as a footstool. But so, you kind of think, well, it's that tragedy, isn't it, of women of that era. She was so incredibly bright. If she'd been a man, then she would have been encouraged to enter service of some description. But she had this tremendous sense of fun. So that's how she used her intellectual prowess. Because even when she was at college, at university, she did stuff like she invented an impoverished artist. And she did loads of paintings and sold them, and it took ages before it was discovered as a fraud. Basically, she made loads of money at Cambridge by selling these sort of paintings of this fictitious artist. She also She wrote a lot of articles for the student newspapers about the college, which she renamed the college Caterham on the Cheap. And the dining room, she rechristened that as a pub called the Clutch and Gearbox, and the college porter was referred to as Lord Shortage of Intellect. And she had a kind of interesting time at Cambridge as well. She sort of fell in with an interesting crowd. There were a lot of sort of very exotic lesbians who she kind of hung around with. And she had a couple of affairs with other women at Cambridge. But eventually she married a man called Frank Pollard, who she called Uncle Gregory. It's not weird. And they kind of had a sort of... She originally was engaged to someone else, but the guy she was engaged to was gay, and he handed her off to Uncle Gregory, to Frank. But they had anyway. This is all boudoir history, but they didn't consummate. She was quite disappointed. They never consummated their marriage. They had a platonic relationship. She said, "I can't say I was in love with him, and I don't fancy he was with me. We just got along awfully well." And she's like, "Do you know there are worse marriages, aren't there? I've been in worse relationships than that." Anyway, so she was sort of unfulfilled personally and professionally. And so when she left university, she moved to London and she fell in with a gang of girls, and they were kind of all slightly bored aristos. So there was a girl called Brunhilde, who was Sister Agatha. There was a woman called Rachel Pinney, who was Red Biddy due to her communist leanings, and a woman called Joy Moore, who was Kate O'Brien the Narc. And they were the sort of initial founder members of the Ferguson's gang. And then Ruth Sherwood joined, who was the Bloody Bishop. So she sort of, Peggy kind of got together this gang of women. And they were, because the 30s, obviously, I mean, I always think the 30s is very interesting. And I've always been fascinated by the 30s. And I suppose, I don't know if you feel like this, but in recent years, you think, gosh, quite a lot of lessons to be learned from the 30s. And among the sort of historical resonances, there was a housing crisis at that time in England as well. And a lot of the slums were being knocked down, and the people were being rehoused. And there was a lot of debate about planning and a kind of an ideological debate about, do we build in the countryside? What do we do? What's the countryside for? And Peggy and her group were quite influenced by a lot of the sort of thinkers about planning policy at the time. She, particularly Bertram Clough Williams Ellis, she was hugely influenced by him. Clough Williams Ellis, many of you will know, he sort of idealised rural England. He said, "England, as I verily believe, stood forth as the loveliest thing that God and man had ever made between them." Right, and then he went to build Portmeirion in Wales. Presumably Wales wasn't all that. Thought he could improve it, there was sort of lively debate among the members of the gang. They were like, what can we do to preserve rural England in the face of the sprawling octopus of development? So they decided to form this group, the Ferguson's gang, after this mythical Ferguson. And they styled themselves as a gang of Cockney gangsters who did these sort of... They stole all the toothpicks from the Dorchester Hotel and held them to ransom to make money for the gang. And they basically just had a massive laugh. And as so many groups of women do, and this is one of the things, whenever you look at gangs of women, what I love about them is that they always make lists. Very thorough admin. When you get, your mafia, not so big on admin, big on killing. Groups of women, a lot of admin. We like a book. So they had this book called The Boo that they, because they missed the K off. So The Boo was where they wrote down all their exploits. And it's fantastic if you read their entries in this book, because they largely talk about the food that they ate. Because... they went on all these expeditions. One of their first ones was to Stonehenge. Because I don't know if you know this absolutely blew my mind, but Stonehenge, until about 1918, if you went to Stonehenge, there was a kiosk there where you could go and rent a hammer and just chip a bit off Stonehenge and take it home with you. And at the time that the gang was formed in the 1930s, the idea of preserving these great historical monuments was very in vogue. And so they were sort of part of this movement of preserving rural England. So they raised a huge amount of money for various places, obviously Shalford Mill, Watersmeet Valley in Devon, the Roman Amphitheatre Fund in Chester, the Old Town Hall at Newtown on the Isle of Wight. That was one of their major projects. Lake Buttermere in Cumbria. And they also preserved huge swathes of the Cornish coast. They bought up loads of land around Sennan and around Land's End. And then Peggy Pollard. So the gang, you can read about their exploits. There are 2 brilliant books that have been written about the gang. If you look for Ferguson's gang, you can find those. So the gang kind of continued. They sort of petered out in the 1940s. But then Peggy Pollard, after the gang, she went off and she then moved to Cornwall. And it's, when you think, if I had got a double first in Oriental languages from Cambridge and I'd formed this gang and I'd raised thousands, which now would be hundreds of thousands for the National Trust, I might retire gracefully. She did not do that. She learned Cornish. She didn't only learn Cornish, she became a Cornish bard. She learned to play the Irish harp and became the principal Irish harpist in Cornwall. I don't know if that was hotly contested, but she did. She sort of had this incredible conversion. So then, in the 1940s, having always been a kind of seeker of metaphysical truth, she then converted to Catholicism, and she then raised the money to build a Catholic church on the site of a medieval chapel of Our Lady of the Portal. It's a church, I've been there, I've done my pilgrimage. It's a church called Our Lady of the Portal in St Piran in Truro. Really ugly church. It was built in 1973. And for someone who was campaigning to save the beauty of England, it's a really ugly church. But she was a leading light in the Catholic Church. She ran a prayer circle, so people used to phone each other and say the Hail Mary at each other down the phone. She also became a world expert in goat husbandry, as you do. And she collected funds for black nuns in South Africa. She published several books about Cornwall. She published I can't even read it, but a pastiche on ancient Cornish miracle plays. And she also, in her latter years, despite poor eyesight, she met a young, at the church there was a young altar boy, and she got chatting to him, and he was really into the Narnia Chronicles, and she'd always admired C.S. Lewis, and so she decided to make a tapestry of the Narnia Chronicles. She never read any of the Narnia books. But she got this young chorister to describe them to her, and she made a tapestry which it's bigger than the Bayeux tapestry. It is. I've got the stats somewhere. It is. Let me show you. Hang on. So, the tapestry is longer than 5 football pitches. And nearly 7 times longer than the Bayeux tapestry. The little chorister eventually became a vicar, and he is now a vicar of a parish in Sussex. And he desperately wanted to exhibit this tapestry, but there was nowhere big enough for him. He said it would have wrapped round his church 5 times. So she had this amazing life, and I just what I'm kind of doing here tonight. I'm not really interested in winning the show. What I'm essentially trying to do is pitch a Sunday evening television show. I mean, to be honest, at the British Museum, in my head, I'm doing a TED talk, but I just find the gang so interesting because Rachel Pinney, one of the other members, she went on to be a Greenham Common woman. She came out as a lesbian in her 70s. And my sort of vision for... Imagine, right, it's Sunday night, you've just had your weekly bath. You're there at the telly. And I sort of think the opening scene of these 2 women whose lives have diverged. And, one of them is very sort of traditional Cornish Catholic woman, and the other one is this sort of radical Greenham Common lesbian. I think it's fascinating that they went from this point of both being in this gang to have such different lives. But I think that is the amazing thing about the gang. And the amazing thing about Peggy Pollard was that she was an amazing woman. And I'm going to end with, this is something that was written by Polly Bagnall. And Polly Bagnall's written a book about Ferguson's gang. Her family moved to Shalford Mill after the gang vacated it. And she says in her book, the issues that faced Ferguson's gang are still current today, and we may ask ourselves, how do we improve the quality of life for an overwhelmingly urban population? What do we really mean by the countryside? What is Englishness? How does all this fit in with a diverse world? The problems now, as nearly 100 years ago, may appear overwhelmingly complicated and inscrutable, but the answer is to remain undaunted. Right, and that's what I kind of think is Peggy Pollard was one of those undaunted women. And the final thing I want to share, and this is really just for Iszi and me, this is a letter that Peggy Pollard wrote to the Times in 1941, just after the outbreak of the Second World War, and it's a piece of practical advice to the gentlemen of the country. 4 curling pins may be bought, and the beard tightly rolled up in these and tucked under the chin. The gas mask is then drawn over the face, beard and all, and is perfectly airtight. This discovery has been the means of preserving my husband's magnificent beard, and I submit it to you in the hope that it may save others. So, she loved beard. She was an amazing woman. I present to you Peggy Pollard.
Thanks very much for listening to the Z-List Deadlist podcast. If you want to support the show, please share this episode with your friends. If you hated it, share it with your enemies. Tell them it was really good. You can find out more about me and the show at izzi.com, that is ISZI.com. And also you can catch Lucy Porter on tour, so do check out her website, which is linked to in the show notes. Other than that, I hope you enjoyed the life and times of Peggy Pollard. What an amazing lady. Why don't we hear more about them? Hashtag feminism, hashtag Ferguson gang. Please also, if you're listening to this on an app of any sort, like iTunes or Stitcher, please do write a review. It only takes a few seconds and it means that more people find the show, which means I am more inclined to not lose interviews with really fun people. So anyway, do that. We'll be back in a couple of weeks. Until then, though, why not write me and send in some requests, give me some feedback, and let me know what you think of the show. And do check out the Facebook page as well, Z-List Deadlist. So I will speak to you guys again soon.